theyeshiva.net.
We begin today the second section of halachas of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah called Hilchos Deis, the laws of ethics or of character development. The first section of halachas is Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, in which the Rambam articulates the fundamentals, the foundations of Torah and halacha over 10 chapters. The second section, immediately after that, quite interestingly, is Hilchos Deis, the laws that have to do with Deis. And Deis here means the mindset of the person, and therefore the character of the person. It's about personal development, character development. The Rambam will outline here his halachic system of personal development, personal growth, how a person ought to live, their values, their ethics, their behaviors, their schedule, including his system of psychology, briefly, and his system of health, physical health, emotional health, spiritual health, nutrition, the daily schedule. Hilchos Deis includes 7 chapters, and we begin the first chapter today. So please open up Hilchos Deis. The Rambam, as always, includes all the mitzvahs of the 630 mitzvahs of Torah that he will be covering and exploring in this section of halacha. In Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, if you remember, he introduced it with 10 mitzvahs that he covered over the 10 chapters. Here he says, Yesh b'chlolam achas esrei mitzvahs. In Hilchos Deis, we have included 11 mitzvahs that we're going to be covering. Chamish mitzvahs esrei, b'sheish mitzvahs loisasa, v'zal pratim. 5 of them are positive ones, active ones. 6 of them are things that we abstain from. And here we go. Aleph, lehidamois b'drachav, to imitate the ways of Hashem, to align our pathways in life to the pathways of the divine, which he will explain. Beis, another mitzvah in Torah, is lehidabik b'yodav, to cleave, to be connected to those who know Hashem. Gimel, lehav esrei, to love your fellow. Daled, lehav esageir, to love the stranger, the foreigner, the convert. Hey, shaloi lisnei achem, never to loathe, to hate brothers. Brothers here means, again, your fellow Jew. Vav lahichiach, to be able to rebuke and communicate with somebody who has done, or you feel has done something wrong. Zayin shaloi lahal ben panim, never to shame anybody. Ches shaloi la'anois umlalim, never to oppress those who are the misfortunate, those who are struggling in life. To be sensitive to them, never to oppress them and manipulate their weaknesses for your advantage. Tes shaloi la'alich rachel, not to be a talebearer, going around, telling stories about people, which will, as the Rambam will explain what that means. Yud shaloi linkai, not to take revenge. Yud aleph shaloi lintai, not to harbor grudges. Toxic, not to harbor toxicity, the toxicity of grudges in your heart. Okay, quite a list of mitzvahs to implement. To be your mitzvahs elu b'prakim elu. The elucidation of all these 11 mitzvahs are going to be presented in the subsequent chapters, which are 7 chapters. Aleph, Perik Rishon, the first chapter of Hilchos Deis. Aleph. Deis harbe yesh lekol echad ve'echad mibnei adam. The Rambam begins very interestingly. There are many character traits that every single person has. V'zu mishuna mizu rechayikim mimenu b'yoseh. And one is very different from another one, and often very different and distant from each other. People, in other words, the Rambam is saying, are complex. They're not made out of, one fabric, one material. Every person balances and contains so many different traits and characteristics and temperaments, and very different types. Yesh Adam shehu bal chema kayis tamid. There's a person who's full of wrath. He's always angry. People by temperament, they get angry very fast. Yesh Adam, the person in the opposite type, extreme, shadaitim yushavas alav. He's extremely calm. Ve'ein kayis klal. He never gets angry. Ve'im yichas, if he does, yichas kas ma'at b'kama shana. He'll get a little angry once in a few years. Yeah, we like this guy. As they say in English, once in the blue moon. Generally, he's a very, very calm, relaxed serene person. He's not hot tempered, doesn't lose his temper. Yesh Adam Shul Gval Leiv B'Yos, the person who's very full of pride, self-aggrandizement. V'yesh Shval Ruach B'Yos, somebody who's exceedingly humble. Just a very different attitude. Yeshu Bal Taiva, there's somebody who's full of cravings, full of appetites. He can never satiate his soul by satisfying its appetite. He wants more and more and more, just filled with cravings. And there's somebody who has a very pure, very sensitive, very delicate heart. He will often not even crave for small things that actually the body needs. The types of people who could forget to eat lunch. There's people who have a few lunches, and then there's the types of people that are just very pure hearts, very delicate hearts. There is a greedy person whose soul is so wide, literally wide, it will never be satiated from all the money in the world. There's always more for me to take. Nefesh Rechav is, I have the ambition to swallow and get more and more and more. Kinyan Shenemar, this is described in a pasuk in Koheles, in chapter 5 of Ecclesiastes. Oyev kesef layuzba kesef. Someone who loves money will never be satiated with money. As much as you give, there's always more to take. V'yesh mekatzer nafsha, and then there's somebody the opposite. Mekatzer nafsha means he restricts his soul. His soul doesn't have such a desire, such a unit. Shadaya afilu davar ma'at. It's enough for him, even a small thing. Shalayaspikla. Even that is often not even enough for him. He won't even pursue to get all of his needs. Mamish, the other extreme. Yeshu misagaf atzmei berav. Somebody who's stingy on himself. He will actually remain hungry. The kovetz al yad. He will collect more money and more money and more money. He is so stingy even on himself, it's hard for him to squander his money even in his own needs. He will literally, the Rambam says, he will not spend a dime, a pruta. A pruta was one of the smallest currencies. He will not spend a pruta of his own, only with a lot of pain, when he's forced. It's really hard for him to separate from his money. And then you have the opposite type of person. He'll just squander all of his money consciously. He's just completely free-handed. He'll squander it and spend it all without any meditation or plan. And in the same extremes you have in so many different temperaments and traits. Kigoyin, you have Maholo v'oinen. Maholo is somebody who is always elated in a very dramatic and exaggerated way. And oinen is somebody who's miserable and depressed. The opposites. Chili v'shua. Chili is a very stingy person. Just stingy, cannot handle giving or sharing with somebody else. Earlier the Rambam spoke about Misagaf Atzmei Berav, somebody who's stingy for himself also. He will remain, or she will remain, hungry, not to spend. Here the person is actually not stingy on themselves, but with other people they are so stingy. And then you have Shua. Shua is the contrast of Chili. Somebody who's free-handed, who's a spender, and perhaps for good causes also. Very like before the Rambam spoke about somebody who just will ma'abed kol money. He'll squander, he'll throw out all of his money. Here, it's a person who's actually an extremely, extremely generous person. They'll share with everybody. You have achzari, somebody who's cruel, a cruel person. Rachaman, somebody who's compassionate. You have rach levov, somebody who has a very soft heart, a lot of fear, coward. Amitzlev is somebody who's like a warrior, very strong heart, a very powerful person. Their temperament is just very powerful. And the list goes on of the extremes that so many people have, one extreme or another extreme. And the Rambam continues, between one temperament, one trait, and another trait that's on the other extreme, there are also deyes beinanias. There are temperaments that are intermediate, somewhere in the middle. And also so many different types. V'chol hadayis. Where do all these temperaments come from? Where do these traits come from? You spoke about cruel people and compassionate people. The list of the Rambam, he gave us a list. He spoke about people who are always angry, people who are always serene, people who are very proud and arrogant, pompous, people who are extremely humble, people who are great balei taivas, their appetite knows no rest, and people who are, their needs are very, very small, people who always want more money, and people who, even for their needs, they're not so particular, people who are stingy on themselves, and people who squander everything, people who are always elated, always, exuberant, and people who are miserable and depressed, stingy people, free-handed people, cruel people, compassionate people, courageous people, cowards. Where does all this come from? Says the Rambam, fascinatingly, v'chol hadayis. All these character traits, yesh me'en deyis shem la'adam etchilus briyasa lefitava gufay. Some character traits the person has from the beginning of his creation, and it's based on the nature of his body. Or as we would say today, it's the genetic makeup, the DNA, the genetic code of this particular organism, which basically creates these types of character traits, these types of dispositions, proclivities. Yesh mehen deyis, shetivo shel adam zeh mechuvan v'osen lekabel oisen b'meira yosim v'shara deyis. There are other character traits that a person is predisposed to. They're not born with it, but their nature makes them such that they are much more open. They're much more sensitive and open to absorb these types of character traits, and certain traits will become ingrained in them faster than other ones. This is, I have certain predispositions, certain sensitivities, where I'm very conducive and open to absorb certain traits. Then we come to the whole world of nurture. Things that are not part of the human nature. They're not part of an egg, but I learned them from others. Either actively, consciously, or you could say unconsciously, but I learned them, I absorbed them from others. Or perhaps I acquired them because of a certain thought pattern or a certain idea that developed in me. That caused me. In other words, it's not necessarily that people actually taught it to me. I was in an environment of people, and this is what I learned, or this is how I was educated, or this is the school, or the community, or the home I grew up with, the family I grew up with. But it's actually a thought that the person developed, which of course that thought can also be influenced by others. But it's a result of a thought that I developed, and as therefore these character traits become part of my life. It could be a machshava that I developed in my own heart, or actually I heard it. I heard that this is the right way to live, and I actually implemented it in my life. I decided to act on it until it became part of my heart. These are the different ways in which people operate and how they acquire and become the people they are. Says the Rambam, the two extremes, distant from each other in extremes. In each one of these above character traits is not the good path. It's not appropriate. It's inappropriate for the person to follow them or to teach them to himself. In other words, to follow them, emulating others, or to teach them to myself and become that person. This is all good. If you come to the Rambam and you have a free slate and nothing happened yet, and you're starting your life anew, and you're 1 day old, and you're impressionable, so you ask the Rambam, says, what happens if I find that my nature gravitates there? This is part of who I am. It's part of my DNA. Or, even if it's not part of my DNA, I'm predisposed to it. It's just so easy for me to ingrain this type of attitude. Or, I already learned it. It's part of my nurture. Maybe not my nature, but it's part of my nurture. And I'm already living this way. What happens now? Says the Rambam, you're never ever a victim. Yachzir atzmai lemutav. You can turn yourself to the proper way of living, the good life, v'yelech b'derech ha'tovim, and follow the good path, v'hi ha'derech ha'yishar, and this is the appropriate path. And the Rambam says, what do we mean by ha'derech ha'yishar? the right path or the correct path. Let me see how he translates. Haderech HaYeshara. Halacha Dalet, Haderech HaYeshara. The straight path. This is the straight path. Says the Rambam, what is the straight path? He mideh beinanis shebechol deya v'deya mikol hadeyos sheyesh le'adam. This involves discovering the midpoint temperament of each and every trait that a person possesses within his or her personality. V'hi hadeya, and this is the character trait, shehi rechoika mishtei haktzavos richuk shava. It is equidistant from either of the extremes, ve'eina kroi v'loy lezu, without being close to either of them. This is the straight path, which is the mideh beinanis shebechol deya v'deya. To be able to discover the midpoint, the center point, the midpoint temperament of all of the above and so many other character traits. And as he said, it's equidistant from either of the extremes. Lefichach, therefore, tzivu chachamim harishonim, the early sages have instructed us. Sheyehi adam sham dei oisav tamid u'mishayer oisam u'mechaven oisam b'derechem tzoyis kedei sheyehi shalim begufay. That a person should always evaluate himself or herself. A person should be introspective. Sham de Yosef means I want to always evaluate, examine, scrutinize my character traits, how I'm living, calculating them, evaluating them, and directing them along the middle path that the Rambam described. And he says, Kadeshi yehi shalem begufay, in order that the person should be healthy in their body. Some manuscripts take out the word begufay because he's not only talking about the body, he's talking about the body and the mind and the soul. So the Rambam is saying, Kadesh Yehi Shalem, the person should be wholesome, the person should be a wholesome human being. And Shlemos, wholesomeness, comes from cultivating the Derech Emtzai, is the middle path. Ketzat, what does this mean practically? Says the Rambam, Lo Yehi Balchei Manoyach Lichos. So a person shouldn't be wrathful, who gets easily angered. It's just so easy for me to lose my temper, and I literally lose it. That's not the way to live. But don't go to the other extreme. You have the extreme of always being angry. The other extreme is, I'm like a corpse. I don't feel anything. I become like completely detached, apathetic, indifferent, out for lunch and breakfast and dinner. Nothing registers, which is sometimes the opposite reaction. Maybe if somebody grew up in a situation where they saw so much intense anger and so much intense emotion, they go to the other extreme. They don't feel anything. The person around them calls them dead. It's a dead person walking. I don't feel anything. I'm never angry. It's great. I never raise my voice. I never scream. I never holler. I never lose my temper. But there's a price to pay. Price to pay is dead people also don't scream. Person is dead. There's no feelings. Ela Beinanit is the intermediate path. Lo yichas ela al davar gadol sharoi lichas elav. Don't get angry only if it's a major issue that is really worthwhile to get angry, and there's a reason for that. At least you have to display anger. You have to display hurt and pain, and feel hurt and pain because you really do not want that such a thing should happen again. He spoke about the Baltaiva, the person whose cravings are incessant, they know no end. So the Rambam says, can you cultivate a lifestyle in which you do crave things that the body needs? That the body needs in order to live, in order to exist. I can't live without it. He says, this you want a craving for, you want a yearning for. Kinyan Shenemar, like the Pasuk says in Mishnah, Proverbs 13, Tzadik oichel l'soiva nafsha. The tzaddik, which means the righteous person, the person who's living according to the derech hayeshara, the straight path, eats in order to satiate their soul. He eats to satiate his soul. He doesn't live to eat. He eats to live. There's a very big difference. I want my soul to be satiated so I should be able to live. And that's why I'm going to eat. He spoke about the nefesh rechava, that stingy person, that person whose soul just wants more and more and more money and will never stop. As oyev kesef lo yizba kesef, right? He called him a nefesh rechava, the greedy person who cannot be satisfied with all the money in the world. Says the Rambam, that's not the way to live. Do not toil, do not become completely immersed in your business in order to acquire those things that you need now in order to live. Kinyan shenemar, like the Pasuk says in Tehillim 37, toiv ma'at la tzaddik. For the tzaddik is good a little bit. There are people They are so excessively indulgent in their work to make another dollar. They don't know what their children look like. So the Rambam says, it's important for the person to want to be able to have what they need. But perspective. What I want to work in order to be able to have what I need now. Don't let it overtake your life. You work to live, you don't live to work. Don't be very stingy. The opposite. Don't squander and just scatter all your money. You give tzedakah according to what you can afford, and you lend in an appropriate fashion to the person who needs. And what does he mean appropriately? Again, it should be in a way that is measured. Don't be this frivolous, exuberant person who's just elated in a very dramatic way, but not melancholy, depressed, and miserable. A person, all the days of his or her life, should be besimcha, should be joyous, with serenity, tranquility, and with a pleasant face and a pleasant countenance. And the same is true with all other character traits. You want to try to find and discover and cultivate what he called the intermediate path, which is equidistant from both extremes. The derech hayishara, the straight path. The derech zuhi derech hachachamim. This path is the path of the wise. Somebody asked the question, what does it mean the middle path? Is it just a little bit from this and a little bit from this? There's going all the way right, there's going all the way left. Imagine a line. One is one extreme, and the Rambam is saying, just like not too hot, not too cold. Is this just a mix? Is it a cholent of one extreme and another extreme? Or is it a third quality? It's a third quality? So it's a good question. It will become clear soon. I want to quote an extraordinary teaching from Talmud Yerushalmi Chagigah, chapter 2. And I'm going to say it in Hebrew because it's an incredible quote, which may be one of the sources of the Rambam. The Yerushalmi says that there are two paths in life. One is a path of snow, and one is a path of fire. And basically, you're walking, it's as though the Gemara is saying you're walking on a very, very tight bridge. On one side, you have snow, fire I should say, and on the other side, you have snow. Hita bazeh, if you gravitate this way, he says you fall into the fire. And if you gravitate this way, you fall into the snow. And the Yerushalmi says, if I gravitate this way, I die, I get burnt in the fire, and the other way, I freeze to death in the snow. Mayasa, yahalach be'emtza. So I have to walk mamash in the middle between these two extremes of fire and snow. And Yerushalmi is basically telling us here, there's one extreme of fire where you get burnt up from the heat, and there's the other extreme of snow where you don't get burnt up, but you freeze to death from the coldness. These are the two extremes the Rambam is describing, and I have to find the derech hayishara, the perfect equilibrium, the balance. Hey, a person whose character traits are intermediate, are centered, this person is called wise. Somebody who works on himself and is very meticulous with himself, and he decides that he wants to distance himself from the intermediate path either to one side or the other side, this is called the chassid, the uniquely pious human being. Somebody who decides that he's going to distance himself from pride to the other extreme, and he's going to be extremely humble. He's not following here the derech beinanis, the intermediate path. He actually gravitates to one extreme. He's called a chassid. This is midas chasidus, the attribute of piety, a life of piety. If he distances himself from arrogance, pompousness, self-aggrandizement, to the center point, this person is called wise. A wise person, a chacham. V'zui midas chachma. This is the attribute of wisdom versus midas chasidus, the attribute of piety. Valderech zu shar kol hadei, the same is true with all the other temperaments and traits. V'chasidim harishonim, hoyumatim deis shalem ederechem tzoyis k'derech shnei aktzavos. the early Hasidim, the early pious Jews, would indeed intentionally gravitate and cultivate temperaments and character traits that were not always in the middle, but rather to one side or the other. Some character traits, they would gravitate to one side, and the other one to the other side. In other words, sometimes they would go more to one extreme, and some days they would go to the other extreme. This is called lifnim mishur sadin, which means going beyond the letter of the law. Vav, this is not just interesting discussions about people's nature. This is halacha. This is a book of halacha. We are instructed to follow these paths which are intermediate. They are the good life. They are the pathways of goodness and righteousness and straightness. Shenemar, the pasuk says in Parshas Kisavai, v'halachta bidrachav. You should follow, you should walk in his ways, in Hashem's ways. Parshas Kisavai, Dvarim Chavches, Deuteronomy 28. Kach limdu befirush mitzvazu. This is what our sages taught about the commentary. What is this mitzvah? What does it mean to follow in Hashem's ways, to walk in his ways? What does it mean? I'm following his path. So our sages said, Mahu nikre chanan afate yechanan. Just as he's called gracious, you should be gracious. Mahu nikre racham afate yeracham. Just as he is called compassionate, you should be compassionate. Mahu nikre kadosh afate yekadosh. Just as he's called sacred, you should be sacred, holy. And indeed, this is why the prophets called Hashem with all of these descriptions, descriptive names. Erech hapayim, slow to anger, easy to forgive. Rav Chesed, abundant kindness. He has abundant kindness. Tzaddik, righteous. Yashar, straight. Tamim, wholesome. Gibber, mighty, powerful. Chazak, strong. V'kayotzeb, and all of these descriptive names of Hashem discussed earlier in chapter 6 of Yesodei HaTorah. Lohidiyah, to teach us shehem drachim tovim v'yesharim, that these are the good ways to live. And a person is obligated to cultivate them in his life, to live this way, and to imitate, to become aligned, to become a reflection of Hashem according to the capacity of the human being. So all of these descriptions that the sages defined Hashem by, Gibor and Chanun and Rachum and Kadosh and Tzaddik and Yashar and Tom and Erech Habayim and Rav Chesed, is what? Is in order to help us fulfill this mitzvah of imitating Hashem, of aligning ourselves with Hashem, telling us that these are the ways in which we become a manifestation of the kedusha, of the energy, of the divine energy in our lives, which I think the Rambam is telling us here, that the intermediate path then is not just, a cholent, taking a little bit of this and taking a little bit of this. How is it? What people are robots? What I could get to the point, the midpoint? There's the midpoint between arrogance and humility. There's the midpoint between exuberance, elation, where I'm delirious, and depression and misery. People are not computers. What's this midpoint? Midpoint, and then the chassid says, I'm not going to do midpoint, I'm going to go a little bit that way. There is really a very powerful idea. The midpoint, the center, right? Of course, there's no such a thing physically as the center. Either you're on this side or you're on this side. So the Rambam says it has to be equidistant, equally distant from this extreme and this extreme. What it really means is, it's not just a cholent, a mixture of one mid and another. I mean, this is the way I understand it. What the Rambam is really teaching us here is that there's a mitzvah of a halachta b'drachav. There's a mitzvah that when I can align myself with Hashem, I can become a manifestation of divine energy in this world. And when I can become a manifestation of divine energy in this world, then, even if I have certain genetic dispositions, and even if I have certain character traits that I was born with, and things that I acquired through education or through nurture, things that I taught myself or things that others influenced me, and they may be very deeply ingrained in me, but a human being nonetheless has an element of infinity within them. So the person now is not defined and stuck in any particular modality. The Rambam doesn't acknowledge the statement, this is who I am, this is who I must remain for the rest of my life. Not because we deny nature and we deny nurture. He did not do that. But because we appreciate the extraordinary resources and gifts and power and potential that every single human being has to become a manifestation of divine love, of divine compassion, of divine graciousness, of divine confidence, of divine power in this world. And then what type of person are you? You're not the person who has to go to extremes. Extremes basically means I'm lost in it. Rather, the person actually becomes an extraordinary synthesis of the best and the most beautiful in life, because you're a manifestation of the divine in life, which is the goodness in every single situation, the truth of every single situation. Zion. Easier said than done. How does a person begin to live according to these character traits until they become part of him? I was born differently. These are my struggles. These are my challenges. So the Rambam says, Yaseh v'yishne v'yishalish b'maisim shoysal piyadeyasem tzoyis v'yachze b'hem tamid. Achiyum aseyem kalim alav v'loyih b'hem teirich alav v'yikavu adeyas b'nafsha. There's only one way. You do it, and you do it again, and you do it a third time, 3 times. You basically understand what these character traits are, and they become habits that you do. You don't talk about them. You don't only think about them. You actually do them. You practice them constantly, tamid, perpetually. And you know what happens? Every time these actions become easier. And at some point they're not even a burden anymore because they become part of your soul. Now it's fascinating, these words, because today we know that when we do things over and over and over again, we create what today we call neural pathways, literally new highways in the brain, new wires in the brain, connecting cells, and it becomes part of our nature. It becomes part of how my brain responds to things. And maybe this is one of the reasons the Rambam calls this Hilchos Deis. Somebody says, why is it called Hilchos Deis? It's talking about midos. It's talking about dispositions, emotions, temperament. Because by the Rambam, your das is so critical and so vital here. And since these names are the names by which the Yoitzer, the Creator, is called, as he said before, Hashem is called all these names, Chanun and Rachum and Kadosh and Erech Hapayim, Rav Chesed, Tzaddik, Yasher, Tam. In other words, these pathways, these temperaments are names that we use for the Rebbeinu Shalom. And here I'm going to leave you with a question. The word Yoitzer, the Rambam does not use in Mishnah Torah ever again. He only used it once in Hilchos Yesodei Torah, and this is the second and last time he will call Hashem Yoitzer. He could have said Nikra B'hem HaKadosh Baruch Hu Haboire. He uses the word Yoitzer. Why does he choose this phrase to describe Hashem? This is the second and last time in the whole Mishnah Torah. Question. So since these are the names with which Hashem is called, and this is the intermediate path by which we are obligated to live and follow, Nikraz derech zu derech Hashem. This path is called the path of Hashem. This is the divine path, because these are the names that Hashem was given. And this is the path that he wants us to live. This is called the divine path in life. It's the path that Avram Avinu taught his children. Shenemar, the pasuk says in Vayera, Hashem says, Ki yedaitiv. I love Avram Avinu. You know why? I love Avram Avinu because he's going to teach his household and his family and his children to observe the path of Hashem. Which path is he talking about? V'shamru derech, which path is he talking about? He says, this is the path that Avram Avinu taught his children. Living a divine life. Being a manifestation of the divine qualities in your own life. V'hailech b'derech zu. And when you follow this path, mevi toiva ubracha la'atzmai. This is not just a path, I'm telling you to do it, because it's the path that we say you have to live. The Rambam says the reason you have to live this path is, Hashem wants us to live this path, is realize that this is the path that brings the greatest goodness and the greatest blessing to your life. Shenemra, as the pasuk continues, L'man havi Hashem al Avram es asher diber alav. In order for Hashem to bring to Avram that which he promised him, this derech Hashem allows you to become a vessel and a conduit for an extraordinary, great life of goodness and of blessing. This concludes the first chapter of Rambam Hilchos Deis. So it's interesting that the Rambam here calls Hashem Yoitzer, the former. The way I understand it is What the Rambam is telling us here is, these are the names in which the Yotzer was called. The former was given these names. What does it mean, the former? The one who formed life. The one who formed the physique of every person and every organism and everything. And the one who formed my mind. The one who formed my DNA. The one who formed every cell. The one who formed every neuron. The one who formed every nerve cell. The one who formed me, who formed my life physically, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, chemically, atomically. The one who formed me on a cellular level. The one who formed me genetically. He formed me. If these are the names by which the Yotzer is called, this is how he formed me. He formed me by these names. In other words, he gave me the potential to be able to become a reflection of these names. I was formed by the one who has these names. So I can become a manifestation, an embodiment of the one who formed me, of the Yotzer. There's a beautiful expression Chazal say, L'damois, the Rambam also brings it, L'damois hatsura liyotzra. L'damois hatsura liyotzra. I think that's the key. You want that the tzura should become aligned with the Yotzer. The tzura is the form. The Yotzer is the one who formed it. When I live a certain way, the tzura becomes a mirror of the Yotzer. It becomes a reflection of the former, of the creator. What he created becomes a manifestation. And the human being, due to his or her power of choice and soul, could become that tzura that reflects the Yotzer. And that's the midah hemtzayis he's talking about. Sometimes there's also midas chasidus, which means I manifest something of the divine in even a more intense and powerful way. That's called midas chasidus versus midas chachma. That's how I understand it. Does he mean middle because it means that you have to keep balanced and not go to extremes about anything? Yeah, of course, that's what he says clearly. That the middle means there's a balance. You're not this extreme. That's basically what he means. There's the middle path. You're not extreme. My point was, can you really pinpoint the middle? The middle is really the essence. It's the essence that perfectly combines both. Why does it combine both? Because it transcends both, because it's not fixed in one or the other. And that's what he calls the Derech Hashem.
This class is brought to you by theyeshiva.net. Please help us continue the classes. Make even a small contribution at www.theyeshiva.net/donate.